All right, hello everybody. Welcome to week 6 of CITBT 275/475. I hope you guys are doing well. This week we're going to be talking about for loops and Foreach loops. And so what we're going to do is dive right into the code this week instead of sort of doing our normal presentation. And I wanted to try this out and see how it goes. You guys can let me know if you like it more or less, or I'd appreciate any feedback on the videos. But let's go ahead and dive right into it. So I have MAMP already up and running, so make sure you've got MAMP running. I've got my local host open up here in a web browser, and I've got some notes that I'm going to grab as well. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to cover the for loop with a simple array, and then we're going to talk about a for each loop with a multi-dimensional array. And so a multi-dimensional, if you didn't run into that in your sort of research so far, is any array that includes arrays inside of it. So if you think of this as like a familial relationship, this would be a parent array with children array inside of it. That would be what we consider a multi-dimensional array. I think I actually have these over here. Perfect. So what we're going to do is create a new file. So I'm going to right click. I've already got my week 6 folder set up. Right click on this, hit new file. I'm going to save this as index.php. Then I'm using Emmet, which is a sort of helpful tool you can install on Sublime Text. And I'm going to create my doc type. And we're going to give this a title of for and for each loops. Inside of this, we're going to create our PHP tag. And we're going to operate inside of this PHP tag. So first, I wanted to show you guys a sort of simple array. And so with a sort of standard array, it's going to look something like this, right? We have our array name. So let's call this favorite foods. And inside that array, you can do things like pizza. We could do hot dogs, and we can do salads. Right, and so this is sort of a simple array. It's very easy. If we wanted to, we could just say echo out favorite foods, and then we can say pizza. And obviously, this doesn't seem very helpful, right? But the important thing here is that we can store information, and now what we can do with multi-dimensional arrays, which we'll run into a lot when we start working with WordPress, is we can start to loop through sets of content. And so first, we're going to set up this multiple. We're going to set up a for loop. And so to do that, we just create the, you type the word for, and you're going to get this handy little drop down. You can click on that, and it's going to give you the syntax for it. And so inside of this, we have 3 different parameters. First, we have our initial value. And so in this case, it is going to be equal to 0. So we're setting this variable of I to equal 0. The second value is our sort of logic check, because what a for loop does is it iterates over a value until it sort of matches a specific rule or condition that you set. And so here, I is less than 10, for instance. If this is true, it'll continue to loop through this block of code. And then finally, after that, we have what we're going to sort of do to this initial variable value to sort of increment it. And so in this case, we're just incrementing it by 1. So every time we loop through this value is going to change to 1, and it's going to run this check again. So we say first, obviously 1 is less than 10. So go ahead and increment and run this code. This becomes 1, and then it does this again. 1 is less than 10. Go ahead and increment. That brings it up to 2, and so on and so forth until we get to 10, right? And so if we went ahead and we echoed the increment value here, we'll hit save. We'll head back to our document, and we see 1 through 9, right? And if we wanted to, we could sort of concatenate a line break on here, so it's a little bit easier to see. Hit refresh, and so you can see it's incrementing through each of these values, looping through all of these in this for loop until the value is less than 10, and then it sort of stops, right? So we have 10 values here because 0, we start at 0 in PHP. So this is our first value, and then the number 9 here is going to be our 10th value. And so this is a simple for loop, and this is it can be helpful and useful in certain cases, but practically speaking, for each loops are going to be the ones that we run into more often in WordPress. And so in WordPress, for each loops, they loop through content as much as that content exists. And so this might be a more performant loop, meaning that there's very clear outlines there's very clear rules for this sort of set of code to run. With a for each loop, there's a potential that this could run hundreds to thousands of times on a page. And so when you're building your application or your website, you have to keep that in mind and make sure that you're not causing any performance issues by doing something like this. But the nice thing about Foreach loops is that we can create really complex sort of data structures or inherit really complex data structures and then display those on a page. So let's do this favorite foods example again. But this time we're going to create it using a multi-dimensional array. And so if you haven't set up your arrays this way already, let's go ahead and do that again. So for the first value, we're going to create another array. And inside that array, we're going to create a item called, so our favorite food name. And then the first value, we're going to say pizza. Our second array value is going to be cost. And then we can give it that dollar amount for the actual cost of the pizza. Our third value is going to be location. And we're going to say where our favorite pizza is. So for me, maybe it's Southway. And this one needs to be a string. Southway pizza. And then we are going to include a description. So another string, and this time we're just going to put a block of lorem ipsum in there for the sake of our example. So here we have an array inside of an array, right? So this is our first value, our second value, and we're going to make sure to remove the semicolon. And this is a comma separated array. And I'm actually going to bring this down just to make it a bit more sort of easy to read. We'll create another array. And inside that array, we can put our second favorite food. So in this case, we're going to do name equals hot dog. Our cost is going to be a value of, I'm just going to say $2.99. Our location is just going to be Costco. They have the best Polish dogs. I'll keep single quotes just for consistency here. It's always good to sort of keep the same formatting and syntax formats. So if you use double quotes, that's fine. If you use single quotes, that's fine. Just make sure to be consistent about it. So we'll put lorem in there as well. And then, of course, we'll put our final array value. And for this one, it's going to be, and I'll actually just copy this. Oops. Copy this array. And this one, I'm going to capitalize pizza, is going to be salad. Salads are a bit more expensive. Let's say $12.99. My favorite salad has got to be the Tomato Brothers. And we have our description, right? All right, I'm going to check my formatting just to make sure everything's right. Everything looks okay at first glance. We'll hit refresh. We don't see anything going on here, and that's because we haven't actually looped through our code yet. And just for clarity, I'm going to add an HR here, a horizontal rule, sort of separate everything out. So we know all of our code should be below this line. Let's go ahead and do a var dump as well, just to see how our favorite foods variable is doing. All right, we have all of our values here. If you wanted to format this so you could actually read it a bit better, remember you can do echo and then put a pre-tag around your code here, and it'll automatically sort of pre-format it for you. Use my sniffles. I'm getting over a cold. So now we can see, okay, here's our first array item. It has a key of 0, and that's because it's the first item here. And then we have our hot dog, and then we have our salad, right? So we don't have to give each item here a name. We could pass in food 1, right? Like this, if we wanted to specifically name this. If I hit refresh here, you'll see that it inherits that name for the index value. But we can also just let PHP index it itself, and that's totally fine. And then what we can do now in our for each loop, and in my opinion, this is a bit more straightforward than the for loop as far as the logic goes. When you're creating a for each loop, your first value inside this parentheses is going to be the variable that we're looping over. And so in this case, it's going to be favorite foods. And we say for every favorite food as, and this is the variable name that you'll be using inside of this block of code. So this here, we could echo out, for example, something like this, name. And this value doesn't actually matter. It can be whatever you want. The sort of standard convention is that you do the singular version of whatever your variable name is. So if it's favorite foods, we can do favorite food, right? So this is our singular version because every time we loop through this, we're only going to get this array information, and then we'll continue on to this one, and then we'll have this as our last one. So for now, let's go ahead and add a h2 in front of this. Concatenate it on there. So our food title, or our food name here, is going to be a heading, which is going to be good. And then finally, this last value, you don't have to, we can just go ahead and remove that, and we won't need it for our for each statement here because we're just looping over these items, and that last value lets you lets you deal with like the index of it. I very rarely ever have to use that third value, but you might run into that in more sort of complicated scenarios. But let's go ahead and dive back in. We're just talking about sort of the simplicity of loops so far and how we can loop over information. And ultimately, just to give you guys some sort of context, everything that we're doing here is something you'll run into when you're working on the front end of a WordPress website or something like that. And so I'm not necessarily, I'm focusing less on like how do we use PHP as a sort of language to build something custom, and more about how we use PHP to sort of help build out WordPress websites. So I digress. So here we go. Favorite foods. We have our name. You can see that showing up here now, pizza, hot dog, salad. And what it's doing, it's going through this array. It's seeing that there's a multi-dimensional array, and it's looping through each of these items. And so now, instead of having to do something like, before you may have been doing something like this, favorite foods, we want to get the first food, and then we want to get the first food name. Let's hit save and refresh, and we should get pizza, right? Because that's our first item in our sort of multi-dimensional array. If we wanted to get the second one, we'd type in 1 here and we get hot dog, right? That's great, but then you have to manually code this, and it's not very sort of scalable or flexible once you start adding new content, and sort of content is dynamically changing, right? Because the idea here is this content here would be populated by a database connection, stored in the database, and we will go through that process once we get to sort of WordPress, is pulling content onto pages from our database. So this is what we were doing before, and now we're actually going to loop through each of these, and now this can be as many content items as you want. Imagine these being different pages or different modules or different products, whatever it is. You can pull as many onto the page as you like, and we can easily do something like this. Let's call this an H3. We can say favorite, let's pull in the cost. And we're going to pull in our location as well. And then finally, we'll pull in our description. Of course, we don't want description to be a heading, so we'll change that to a paragraph tag and hit refresh. And now we have let me just comment this out really quick. We have every piece of our sort of content looped over, right? We have our price, we have our pizza, we have our text. So it's very sort of easy now to manage anything. So if you wanted to change the price of something, we could easily do that up here in the array, and it will automatically sort of loop through it again and re-display what our changes were. And so the for each loop is super powerful. Next week, we're going to be talking about the while loops, which WordPress uses as well. And so get really comfortable with for each loops. These are really sort of useful tools to loop over sort of sets of content that you have on a page. Of course, we can do things like this as well. So we can give this a class name of food name. We could give this a class name of food cost. Just to speed things up, I will copy this. And we can do food location, and then finally food description, excuse me. So now if we inspect all of these, we have our class names showing up here as well. So you have food name, food cost, food location. And then all you have to do, if we go into our head, for example, and I'll just do an inline, an internal style sheet here just for the sake of time. But if you do start playing around with style sheets, you always want to make sure they're external. Let's say food name. We want it to be a font family sans serif. Hit refresh. And now all of our food names are going to change. Our food cost, we could set the color to Dodger blue. Now all of our costs are going to change. We can float these right. And you can sort of start to see how maybe we build out, so these are our favorite foods, but this could easily be a menu at a restaurant. It could be products on a website. Whatever it is, you can sort of see how you can start to style all of these elements as one whole. We could even go as far as to put HTML tags around these as well. So if we wanted to just quickly say div class equals food container, and then we wrap all of this text in that div, and we now go and inspect. Whoops, I missed a semicolon here. We now go and inspect. Each of these items is now inside of a container as well. So you can start to see how you, as you're building out, hopefully you can see that, it's kind of small. You can start to see we have all these food containers. We could easily say max width of 400 pixels, and we want to float these left as well. Now they all sort of float left of each other. Let's give it a margin right of 1em. Give some spacing there, and we'll say width equals 50%. I'll remove the max width, sorry. 45%, there's some box model issues here because I'm not running a framework to remove like the padding from the document and that sort of stuff. But you can start to see now how you can sort of start to style things as one whole instead of having to hard code each of these classes. You can just have the same class name and then have it apply to all these different areas. So this is really powerful, really. Once we get into WordPress, this will be more applicable to actual content, but hopefully you guys can get your favorite foods moved over to this sort of syntax, a multi-dimensional array, and this will help you sort of accomplish our for each loop. And of course, as always, please let me know if you have any questions or concerns about anything that's going on. And so I wish you guys the best of luck, and I look forward to next week.